I just want to do some highlights, talk about some of the
Bob Mariani was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota,
areas.
and graduated
This
from
is
San Diego
meant to
State
be,
University.
open if you
He began
have
his career in
questions or
community
comments.
management as a portfolio manager, managing as many as 13 homeowners associations. His career took him to Fairbanks Ranch Homeowners Association, then to Arizona, where he managed Sun Lakes in Chandler and Sun City, Oro Valley in Tucson. His certifications include Master of Community Association Management and Professional Community Association Manager.
Usually what I do whenever I'm talking about anything is I start from the beginning. In a sense, I'm going to start at the end because the first page here, page 1, is a summary budget. And all of you should have seen this, whether or not you remember seeing it. But this is basically the end product that is submitted to the membership that just gives you the highlights of the budget. And as you can see here, most of this is the operating budget broken down by department. It's got the revenue, cost of goods, the wages and benefits, operating expenses, utility expenses, and then it's got the summaries. Also along with it is the carry forward, which I'll explain in a bit. The community improvements, which is a $80,000 budget in here. And then the special assessment, which I think has been pretty well communicated. That is for Unit 4 for the drainage over there. I know a lot about that firsthand because this year most of that took place right in front of where I live. So it was quite a joy. I thought a few days I wasn't going to get out to get to work, but they're very courteous. They let me out, and I went, oh, dang, all right. So, one of the main things that I want to bring out here in operating is that a huge portion of the operating budget is labor. This essentially is a number of businesses. If you look at it, each one of these departments, in essence, is a different business. I mean, the food and beverage, the swimming pool. I mean, swimming pool, recreation and tennis are kind of combined. Parks and lake and public works and security and admin, golf shop. All of these are operated differently by staff, and so the cost is not unusual. Most homeowners associations have very high percentage cost of labor for their operating budget. An alternative to that is contracting out, which all of you know. That is the situation with security. That's contracted out, and the pro shop's contracted out. So that's not really a direct labor cost, but it's still obviously a labor cost. And typically that can be a way to have a savings. Not always, but the reason that it's typically a savings to contract out is because contractors tend to pay employees less and have less benefits. And so in a sense, you get what you pay for. I'm just giving you a general. That's not always the case. But it's a different model than we used in most cases here. The downside of contracting is, you lose some control. Obviously, you can't decide who's going to be employed by that contractor, at least to a large degree, depending on what's written in the contract. And again, the upside is a good possibility of savings. So it depends on You know, do you want more control and be able to utilize your personnel the way you want to on a daily basis, or do you want the savings? And those are general thoughts when it comes to in-house labor and contract. And there are a number of communities that have the model that we use. Some things are contracted out, some things aren't. And I know the last place that I worked, we had everything in-house except for janitorial. That was contracted out. You know, that could change any time, but it worked well there. Every community is a little bit different. And in this community, I'm sure we're always going to be looking at, you know, what's the best case? Should we be contracting out other services that we have here, whether it be the security like we have now, or, you know, golf, food and beverage, administration, any of that can be contracted. Another part of this budget outside of the operating is the community improvements. Community improvements is basically if we want to have something that's $2,500 in value or more, that is, say, a piece of equipment. It could be new benches or tables or things like that. Even a new landscape project could be in CI, what we call CI, or community improvements. This year we actually have one landscape project, and that's to landscape the I guess I'll call it the hill or embankment in front of the clubhouse. That should be done later on this year. It's $80,000 this year, but could be more. We just budgeted less because obviously we had a little bit of a budget challenge this year, and it was quite a substantial increase. So we tried to limit expenditures wherever we could. And the guideline, or not the guideline, but the regulation on the CI is that you can have as much as 1.5% of the previous year's gross expenses. And so that's how we calculate it, and that'd be somewhere around $125,000. So this is about 2/3 of the max that you can have for that. But you could have special assessments approved by the board up to 5% of the previous year's gross expenses, or the membership can approve a larger special assessment. That hasn't happened since I've been here, but it did happen with the clubhouse project. And then, of course, there's the reserve fund, a minor little chunk of funds. That I'm going to go into a little bit more in depth later on. There was a carry forward of $28,873. That means in that fiscal year 16-17, there was that much money that was left over. It was a positive. They were in the black. The reason that it wasn't impacting the next year is that we don't know what that amount is exactly until after the audit. And the audit takes place, or basically ends months after the budget is prepared. So what happens is that money, whether it's a positive or a negative in one year, skips over a year and it applies to the year after. There are other ways to handle this positive and negative. For example, and I bring up the last place I worked, not because one is better than the other. There's a lot of things that were done differently. What they would do is if there was, if there was a negative, they would take it out of other funds. We had a contingency fund and a capital fund. They couldn't take it out of the reserve fund, but that's how it was balanced. So it did not affect the operating account. Here, I explained the way it's done, and that's a good way to do it. And it can have a real downside, because if you have 1 year you have a large surplus, let's say it's a $200,000 surplus, and then the next year you have a $200,000 deficit, what ends up is that $200,000 surplus is applied to the year after, and that lowers the dues. Then the deficit the year after that increases the dues. So you basically, if it's a 200,000 and plus 200,000 minus, it's a $400,000 impact to the assessments down the line. So it can be, I don't think that's happened here. I don't know if it has or not. I'm not sure of the history. But if it does happen, that's a difficult situation. Management, the finance committee, and the board don't come up with numbers just, out of the blue. The process is in depth, and it starts in November, as you can see, where information begins to be accumulated and the managers start working on their own individual budgets. And that works through all the way from November through January. And the last couple of weeks of January is when each one of the managers will get together with the director of finance and me, and we'll go over their budgets in detail and question different line items as to why things have gone up or down, or why maybe they're outside the normal benchmark that you would get from data from other, say, the Community Association Institute or Club Managers Association. These are organizations where you can get some benchmark information for budgeting and a lot of other things. Once we're through, then it goes to the finance committee. And I know it's been done differently here in different years. Some years, I'm sure, it's more intense or less intense. Last year, and what I'm proposing this year, is that we essentially do the same thing, is that we have at least 3 workshops, and preferably 4, with the finance committee. These are open meetings that anybody can come to, anybody can provide input in the meetings. What we do is go through, in the first one, as you can see, we'll review all the fee structures, and there's quite a few fees here, which is, that's not necessarily standard. There's a lot of communities that have far fewer fees. I don't know exactly the history and how things got implemented here or decided. Again, I'll compare the last community that I managed was an active adult community, Sun City. The only fees that they had there were for classes. We handle here an awful lot of fees. That's one of the impacts on the administration, is just handling these fees for all the recreational and, of course, the marina, storage, etc. It also brings in quite a bit of revenue, too, if you look at the summary budget. Then, once February's over, that goes into the board phase. Now, we expect that board members are going to attend the Finance Committee workshops, and most of them do. So by the time that the board's reviewing the budget directly, they should be actually pretty versed in it. They do get the budget at the same time the Finance Committee does. So there's a fairly intense review by the board after the committees complete theirs. Then, if you don't get it out there, if you don't get the budget completed and published to the membership in a timely manner as required by Davis-Sterling Act, there's an issue. And that basically is that if you plan to raise the assessments, you can't do it. Davis-Sterling Act is the primary civil code that oversees homeowners associations. It has about 90% of the requirements in regard to meetings and budgets and just across the board. The other civil code is that has quite a bit of regulations pertaining to homeowners associations, or basically corporations. This is a corporate code. It's far less controlling, I don't know if that's the word, than Davis-Sterling, or comprehensive towards homeowners associations. But there are a number of civil code that we need to pay attention to in the corporate code. When I first started in this industry, it was in the San Diego area in 1980, and there was no Davis-Sterling. So things were very different then. I mean, there essentially weren't any requirements for reserve studies. There weren't any requirements, particularly outside of the governing documents for each community. There was hardly anything that was required. Davis-Sterling came about primarily because there was a lot of abuse in homeowners associations by both boards and in particular financially by management companies. Every homeowners association around uses fund accounting. And the main reason is because we are not formed to make a profit. We're basically formed to provide services. And the idea is outside of the reserve funds that you put aside, although you can put aside other funds, you're supposed to break even operationally. And so that's why we budget that way, is primarily to break even. So fund accounting is more for, rather than identifying profit and loss, although it does identify that, it's assuring that you're using the proper funds out of the proper bucket. In other words, the operating fund is a bucket, reserve fund's a bucket. We do have other funds, like we have a planning fund that you can use for future projects. When the clubhouse was built, we had a clubhouse fund. That's closing up now. And other communities have different kinds of funds. For example, again, the last community that I managed, we had the operating and reserve fund, and we had, I think I mentioned, a contingency fund and a capital fund. And that capital fund was primarily built from either operating surpluses that were transferred over, or mostly by what we called capital contribution fee, which is very difficult, if not impossible, to have in California because of Davis-Sterling. Basically what that was, and this was in Arizona, anytime a home was sold, either the buyer, or typically it was the buyer, but it could be the seller, pays a capital contribution fee. When we're talking about funds, of course, we're talking about, as I say, buckets of money, and most of our money right now is being held in a bank called Alliance Association Bank, and it's a division of Western Alliance Bank. And this has been, if you've read, is fairly recent change in the way that we're doing our banking. You know, we've gone to the coupons and a lockbox. which has helped the admin staff tremendously in time savings, and it's helped in that we're saving a tremendous amount of money in our fees. We don't get charged any fees. We don't get charged for a lot of supplies like all of our check stock and that, and we don't get any charge for the lockbox. The lockbox, basically, it's a service that banks offer and other institutions offer. And what they do is, all they do is process payments. That's all they do. So if you, if you have a Visa card, for example, when you make your payment, it actually is processed, well, typically it is, by a lockbox service, where what they do is get the payments in, and then they deposit the money into the company's account. So that's what happens with your payment, is it goes to this lockbox service. The staff there, and a lot of it's done mechanically, deposits and credits to your account, and then that is downloaded to our system. So there's really no entry on the part of our staff, unless there has to be some kind of adjusting type of thing. Sometimes there's payments that go into the lockbox service and they don't know what to do with it, so we have to deal with that. I think the easiest way to get into reserves, and if you just have, let's say the only thing we had here was like 5 trucks, and they were all purchased at different times, and each one of them cost $25,000. Well, basically what you do is identify those items that you want to put into the reserve steady, major components. And here, the minimum is $2,500. Now that's nothing dictated by law. You could have 500 or 5,000 or whatever you want as a minimum. And that might change in the future, because the value of money obviously is going to change. So 2,500 in 10 years or 20 years from now is going to be fairly minuscule, which scares the heck out of me. Makes retirement a little bit more of a challenge. So in any case, say we have these 5 trucks, and if you were doing things simply, what you'd be doing is saying, okay, we're going to say that the trucks have a 10-year life, and it's going to cost $2,500 or $25,000 to replace each truck. So if there were no inflation and no interest, you put $2,500 away every year. 10 years, you have $25,000. It's a little bit more complicated than that, because there is interest and there is inflation, so typically you want to build factors in for that. The other thing is, that assumes you want to fund for 100%, and most communities don't do that. Most communities are, well, the standards that CAI sets, Community Association Institute, is somewhere between 30 and 70% funded. And that's a guideline. If you're between those, that's considered reasonably healthy. To me, that's a 40% difference. That's quite a difference. So marginally healthy at 30, very healthy at 70 or above. The reason most communities don't fund for 100% is that you never need, or rarely would ever need, there'd have to be some odd circumstances where you're going to need that full funding So most communities are very comfortable if, say, they're funded at 50%, because the funds are on a rotating basis. So at any particular time, you're not going to necessarily need to say that $25,000 right there to replace that truck. And I know that for some of you, maybe that is a real simple concept. For others, maybe not. I don't know how better to explain it than that. A study should be done every year. And I've made it a habit of every year having all the components inspected so that we can determine, do they need to be replaced as projected or not? And just for example, this past year, as part of the budgeting process, all of the components were inspected by the managers. And when we sat down to do our budgets, what we did is question each manager that was responsible for whatever components. Okay, do we need to do XYZ this coming fiscal year? Can we push it off a year? Can we push it off 2 years? What's the condition of the component? Because this is a 30-year projection. So it's not always precisely accurate. You try to get it as accurate as possible. But if something doesn't need replacement, you don't replace it or repair it. You just push it off to the next year. Not all of the clubhouse was reserved for replacement. Certain components of the clubhouse. And that's actually fairly typical. It's not, some communities will reserve for total replacement of a structure, and some don't. And some will do it after a number of years in anticipation that, we're going to have to replace that structure. With the clubhouse, there were components such as, flooring, painting, roofing, that sort of thing that were reserved for. And so the decision was that you could use those reserves, but then there would have to be additional funds, and that's where that special assessment came from. Some of that drainage in Unit 4 is existing. Some of the work we're doing was not existing, it's new. So the reserves can pay for the existing portion. Any of the new drainage that was not there previously needs to be paid for with other funds, and that's why the special assessment. There's quite a bit of information on the website, so you can log in there and go to association documents and then the financial documents, and there's enough information in there to keep you busy for a while. If you look at the little chart, you'll see percent funded. And again, this is a projection of what could take place depending on what the funding is in future years. This past year, the Finance Committee, when we were talking about reserves, took a good hard look at how low our funding was and recommended to the board that rather than just fund the amount that was calculated by the reserve study, additional funds should be placed in the reserves to boost the percentage up. So the proposal is a 13% increase, which is shown on the next page, but over the next, I think, 3 or 4 years. And that then would bring the projected percent funded up over 30% in the year 2020, 2023. There are certain components here that are recognized but not funded right now. Probably all of these, with, I would say, the exception of the dam, maybe funded at some point, but that's a decision that the board needs to make whenever that discussion comes up. The dam, I'm not sure what the value is, but it's incredibly expensive, and the probability of ever replacing the dam is probably zero. You know, with all the new regulations now, it would be almost impossible. The thing that is, so it's very, very important to maintain that dam properly. And that's what we're doing right now. There was some deterioration in the spillway, and there was a reserve. It was projected out a few years, and it was for less than what the cost was. But I think the board wisely went ahead and approved the project anyway, because I'll tell you, you do not want that dam to deteriorate. That is, it would really be a travesty, and I think it can last. It'll outlast us, believe me. But you want it to outlast your grandkids, grandkids. And in a sense, there's really not a specific amount that is strictly allocated for one item. So in other words, what I'm saying there is that just in the case of the spillway, there wasn't enough money in the reserves to do the spillway project. However, the board of directors still has the authority to say, okay, even though there's not enough money there, there's enough money in the entire reserve fund, and that is a very important project, so we're going to go ahead and do that. Obviously, if the more of that kind of thing you do in the future, when we do the reserve study this year, that extra expenditure on that will have a slight impact on the funding amount for the future. In other words, instead of having to fund for $100,000 for spillway repairs, now we're going to say, okay, now we really need to fund $250,000. It's the same way with any of these projects. Some things are so very simple to project to the future. If you have a mower, you know, we know the price of a mower, and we know that in the future it's probably going to be a little bit more, so we can project pretty accurately. When we have things like, let's say, desilting or even some of the culvert work, that's not quite as predictable, because it's you know, some of it's underground. There's a lot of variables. The road work that we did this year, that's a good example, in that the way that reserve was set up, it was set up on a kind of a standard basis, that the prediction is that every so many years you're going to have to do so much repair to the roads and so much sealing or overlay. And this year, the section that we did needed a lot more work, a lot more overlay than sealing, so it was much more expensive. But when we come back to that portion of the roads in a few years from now to do the cyclical maintenance, less will have to be done, because basically this year in that whole section, we overlaid the whole thing. So structurally, it's more sound than if you just seal it with a, you know, basically an emulsion. We have a new reserve specialist coming in actually Monday. They're going to start their on-site inspection of all the components that are in the reserve study and other components that may have to be added or deleted. And that it's a fairly large firm that from the Bay Area. they will have a different format than the previous company, maybe a different approach. What they'll do is they will allow us to organize the reserve steady in not any manner, but most any manner that works for this association. So we'll be able to, with a new company, sort, for example, by types of components. Like, let's say painting. We can go ahead and sort by painting, and it'll show all the exterior and interior painting here, the clubhouse, and other facilities. Or we could sort by the departments. Let's see which manager is responsible for that particular component. Or we can sort by the facility itself. So if we want to see everything that's in the clubhouse or everything that's in the community center. So it will be a much a better and powerful instrument that we can use than what we've had in the past. The reserve fund is a dynamic fund. The same amount of money that goes into it does not necessarily come out of it. So you'll have some years when your funding actually goes up because you spend less than what you put in. And the next year you might spend more than what you put in, so your funding could go down by a few percent. The funding goes by what you need at the time for any particular asset, not what the total value is. The summary budget that you saw at the very beginning is obviously very, very brief summary of this and other funds. So we're working with a number of line items, and the consolidated, the way that's set up is all the first part of the consolidated are all the revenues, and then the second portion are all the cost of goods and other expenses, and then it gives a total for the entire operation monthly and year to date. Then we have department financial statements. The one that's in here is the administration. We have one for security, one for rec, one for pools, et cetera, et cetera. And each month we're looking at, on an operational basis, how we're doing on every one of these line items. Obviously, if you look at it, you can see some of them were well over budget, some well under, a number of them pretty close, and that's going to be inevitable. You try to stick with each line item and try to get as close as you can. When we're not close, we try to make adjustments. Obviously, food and beverage has been our biggest Achilles heel. We're making adjustments to that operation constantly. So you do that during the year, but you also do it during budgeting. So when you find out that you budgeted far too much or far too little, you have to take a look at why was it so far off? What happened? What do we need to do to correct this? And in some cases, it's just we need to budget differently. The operation was okay, but we had too much money, so we're not going to budget as much, or we had too little. So we make those corrections during the budget process. So it's an ongoing monthly and annual process where we're always looking at every single aspect of every single department and doing everything that we can to get within budget. Right now, our budget is extremely close. We're about $15,000 negative operating, which is, I don't know, probably 0.1% of the budget. So we're very, very close right now. And it's amazing we are that close because, again, food and beverage is still a challenge. not meeting budget, and our revenue has been much lower this year, basically in all areas. And a lot of that has been because of the E. coli issue with the lake and people not using the lake as much. And actually we went through a pretty bad period there in the summer where smoke kept people out of the pool area and off the golf course. It really hit us hard. So our revenue is down appreciably. This association is a corporation, and it's actually a one type of a nonprofit. It's a 501c4, and most homeowners associations that are incorporated are C4s. The other common one is a C3. There are a number of nonprofits. C3s are typically like charitable type of organizations, churches, that sort of thing. There are a number of differences, but even here, it's talking about one of the big differences with C3 is that they're restricted to lobbying, political lobbying, that where C4 is not nearly as restricted. More important than that, I think for a number of us that make donations, is that you can write off a donation to a C3. You cannot write off, it's not deductible. If you want to give this association money, you can do it. We'll take it. Can't deduct it. We don't pay taxes on our general or regular income. Your assessments that come in, that we don't pay taxes on that. Now, if we do bring in funds from, let's say we have a golf tournament from the outside or a banquet from the outside, there's a potential tax impact from that kind of revenue. That's, a good and a bad. I mean, if you're making the revenue, it's not so bad to me to have to pay taxes on it if it helps defray some of the assessments. And that's one of the reasons that, I don't know if all of you have read about that. The planning committee has a working group, that sustainability group, that's looking into any and every way to either raise additional revenues somewhere, not association or fee-based revenues, or to find efficiencies to reduce costs. And they've talked to all of the committees, gathered dozens and dozens of ideas, have preliminarily whittled those ideas down to about 10, and at some time here in the near future we'll bring those to the board, and eventually there will be discussions with the membership at large to determine what's going to be acceptable, what's reasonable. Some of it is a bit foreign to what we do now, such as opening the golf course to some degree or another to those that don't live here. One idea was finding a way to have what I was talking about a little earlier, the capital contribution fee, which is, some associations have done that. They've found ways to do it. But it's not easy because Davis Sterling says, you can't do that. Most other states you can. It's a state regulation. You just have to keep in mind, it's a 30-year projection. I hate to call the reserve the annual projection a budget, because it really, at least my philosophy is, it's not a budget, it is projection. And you try to get as close as you can, but the likelihood of the reserves being as close as an annual budget are probably not all that great. Sometimes you're lucky and sometimes not so. The more, I think the better you evaluate the components every year, the better off you are. And doing that sometimes means, like for example, I'll admit that on the roads, instead of getting the engineering report as to what was needed on the roads after the budget was all complete, that should have been done before the budget. So we actually had an accurate number. Then the reserves study could have been adjusted to reflect a $900,000 cost instead of a $600,000 cost. So, moving forward, we need to be very careful and do that type of a thing. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about, and it's actually pretty briefly, are clubs. Clubs are basically, groups of people that have a common interest. It could be a card or a dance club or whatever kind of club it might be. They submit an application to become a club to the board of directors, and the board approves the club. Assuming the board approves the club, they become an approved chartered club. They have certain privileges. They can use the facilities for their card playing or whatever at no cost. The thing with clubs, though, is if they do deal with revenue, they're responsible for that revenue, for if it's sufficient enough for filing taxes and so forth. The reason for that, and the reason for kind of an arm's length relationship with the association, is that the board of directors, outside of saying, hey, the clubs have to abide by our rules just like all of you, the group needs to abide by the rules. Outside of that, there's not much control over what they do. So it would be, I think it's essentially a liability for the association if the association were to say, well, we'll be sure to gather your money and account for it, and if you need to file a tax return, we'll do it for you. That to me would make zero sense, because you're taking on a liability that you have little control over. So essentially, all these groups are independent of the association, other than they're approved for their purpose, whatever that purpose is. Hopefully it's legal. And they can enjoy themselves. We've had some, I'll call it adjustments that we're going through in order to make sure that all the clubs are abiding by the regulations and, getting their parking permits. Basically, we've had some issues in that some of the clubs didn't want their people from the outside to have to pay for the parking permits, and so that's, I just don't think that's acceptable. If we're going to have the rule in, then everybody should have to abide by it. All right, folks. Well, thank you for coming, and hopefully I didn't bore you to death.